It's been called Saudi Arabia's Game of Thrones. Under the leadership of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has arrested dozens of top officials, from princes to ministers to officials in the armed forces, in what the Crown Prince is calling a crackdown on corruption. His government has allegedly detained both the president of Yemen and the Lebanese prime minister, and there's even talk of Saudi Arabia joining with Israel to attack Iran. Joining me to discuss these latest Middle East crises are Rami Khouri, a political columnist, author and senior fellow at the American University of Beirut, Shireen Hunter, a research professor at Georgetown University and author of Iran's Foreign Policy in the Post-Soviet Era, and from Maryland, Fahad Nazar, a consultant with the Embassy of Saudi Arabia in Washington, D.C., and international fellow at the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. Thank you all for joining me on Upfront. Fahad, let me begin with you. Earlier in the show, I interviewed U.S. Congressman Ro Khanna, and he said Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS as he's known, strikes him as not smart and not prudent and could be taking actions that could cause a war in the region. We've already seen him fail to kind of bring Qatar to heel, fail to win the war in Yemen. Why do we think that a confrontation with Iran or Lebanon would be anything other than a failure on his part?
Well, I think that Saudi Arabia's foreign policy has actually been very consistent. I think that it has adhered very closely to the laws, norms, and conventions of international relations. At the same time, I think that Saudi Arabia feels that it is more than about time that the international community starts paying much closer attention and starts to hold Iran specifically as the main state sponsor of terrorism in the region and in the world, as well as some of its many proxies in the region, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others. It is time to hold them accountable.
Fahad, just before we will get to Iran, and I want to talk about Iran and Saudi and the issues you're raising. Just to stick with what I asked about in terms of recent events and MBS, the Crown Prince's behavior, are you saying that him rounding up 11 princes and putting them under detention at the Ritz-Carlton, him threatening Lebanon possibly with war, Iran possibly with war, this whole taking $800 billion apparently from corrupt Saudi citizens, that's just assertive? That's what you would call it? Nothing more than that? It's not a big deal?
No, I mean, I think that the Saudi leadership with King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has charted a very clear course of action for Saudi Arabia's future. I think that Vision 2030 that has been outlined is a broad and ambitious package of economic and social reforms that seeks to transform the Saudi economy and wean it off of its dependence on oil revenues. And it seeks to do that by reducing the size of the public sector and providing the private sector with the tools to succeed and become the driver of the economy.
Rami Khouri, how big a deal, in your view, are some of the more domestic developments in Saudi Arabia over the last couple of weeks?
Well, I think they're enormous. The real problem in Saudi Arabia right now that I see, having lived through and reported on the Arab world for the last 50 years as a journalist in the region, is that Mohammed bin Salman now is bringing in the third wave of Arab autocratic authoritarian rule. The first one was Nasser in the 50s. The second one was Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Hafiz al-Assad in the 70s and 80s. And now this is the third wave. The first monarchy in the Arab world where one person, the Crown Prince, brings into his hands all the levers of power: military, political, economic, religious, social, and media, and foreign policy. This is very dangerous. And the fact that he's inexperienced and young and rather reckless in his wars and in his regional events makes it even more dangerous. So I think what he's doing is almost unprecedented, and it's very dangerous, and it's, I think, for the region, it's going to be a problem.
Let me put that point to you, Shireen. Rami is saying what's happening in Saudi Arabia is unprecedented. Fahad says it's part of a reform movement. But let me just say to you, isn't the problem for a lot of Saudi Arabia's neighbors and rivals in the region that they don't have much credibility to criticize what's going on in Saudi Arabia? If you're Syria, if you're kind of the people who don't like Saudi Arabia, what are you going to lecture Saudi Arabia on? A lack of democracy? There's not much in your own countries.
No, but I think that there are degrees of that. I have no love for the Islamic Republic, and I don't agree with their ideology and so on. However, you have to understand that in Iran you have different centers of power. And actually, there is politics in Iran, and that in some ways could be said that is a major problem for Iran because they cannot take bold decisions. Even I think that despite whatever people say that the supreme leader calls all the shots, that's not true. In Iran, you do have parliamentary elections. They are not perfect, obviously. They are carried out within the kind of confines of the principles of the Islamic Republic. But there has been a great tendency to, by the Saudis, by most of the other, with few exceptions of Persian Gulf Arab states, and obviously Egypt and so on and so forth, to attribute all of their internal problems to Iran. I mean, I'm sorry, the Saudis are the greatest sponsor of terrorism, and they have been. Saudi ideology has destroyed the Muslim world, whether it is the Taliban, Al-Qaeda.
Okay, and that is a common criticism. Let me put that point to Fahad Nazar to respond. Fahad, there is a common view that, yes, Iran supports groups that are listed as terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah in the West, but when it comes to quote-unquote jihadist groups, the Al-Qaeda affiliates, that's really much more a Saudi problem in terms of ideology and financing. You know that's a very common criticism, including from members of the US government.
Yeah, and again, I completely disagree with it. If Saudi Arabia was sponsoring such groups, I think there would be a much bigger outcry from the international community. It would come under sanctions the way that Iran has and the way that Hezbollah and various militant groups are. I don't think it's by accident that Iran finds itself in the position that it does. It has become an international pariah. It's become isolated. It's become subject to sanctions from a host of countries around the world.
But Fahad, the Saudis lost a pretty big vote in the U.S. Congress on Monday night. You talk about pariahs. The U.S. Congress voted 360 to 30 to say that the war in Yemen is not authorized, that the war in Yemen is starving people, that the war in Yemen is causing a crisis in the region. Up to 130 kids a day are dying in Yemen as a result of a Saudi-led blockade and bombing campaign. You talk about being a pariah. Yemen has made Saudi a pariah, even amongst many of its Western allies.
Generally speaking, the war in Yemen began, I mean, it's a civil war at its core. The violence began months before Saudi Arabia was invited, received an official request from the internationally recognized government of Yemen to support it. And there is this perception that Saudi Arabia is preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid. That is simply not true.
Okay, but that's what leading human rights groups and UN humanitarian officials are saying. So they're all lying.
$7 billion worth of aid, humanitarian aid in the form of food, medicine, support to the central bank, to Yemen. Just in the past 2 years, it has cooperated very closely.
So everything's fine in Yemen. People are calling it the world's worst humanitarian crisis. You're telling us money's getting through, things are good.
Things are going through. No, things could absolutely improve. But like I said, this is a civil war. It began when the Houthi rebels took up arms against the internationally recognized government of Yemen. It will end when those same groups put those arms down.
So here's the situation that we're hearing. When the U.S. uses drones to kill people all over the world, it's legal. When Israel bombs the hell out of Gaza and imprisons 10,000, 15,000 Palestinians, it's legal. When the Saudis make the greatest catastrophe in Yemen ever, it's legal. When Sisi puts 40,000 people in jail, it's legal. It's all legal. It's all legal according to the rules they wrote. And they're unelected, unaccountable. They deal with non-participatory political systems. It's incredible. So what we're dealing with is a growing fraternity of authoritarian tyrants who are now directly chromosomally linked to the United States leadership.
Where does it lead? Where does it lead, Rami? Where does it go? What happens next, then, if that's what you're saying is developing?
Well, I think we can see in modern history, especially in the last 15, 20 years, when the pressures build up too much on ordinary citizens, they push back. And so the systems that we have in the Arab world, and I'm talking about the Arab world now, Iran, Turkey, Israel are different, are building up pressure again with massive amounts of disparity and poverty and marginalization and powerlessness. It will manifest itself again as it did 6, 7 years ago in the uprising.
You think we're due another Arab Spring?
Well, we'll have something. We don't know what it is. The difficulty is when you have the American government and the Russian government and externally other powers like Iran, like Turkey, like some of the Europeans, actively supporting these regimes, it's very hard to change them until the pressure gets so big that they implode from within.
And Rami's warning about kind of another Arab Spring, another revolt. What's your concern in terms of in the coming weeks and months about conflict in the region? Are you worried about a new war in the region? Because
I am worried about, to be honestly, I'm very worried about. But if I might, I know that I just want to say is that we have to be a little bit clear about terrorism and international terrorism. I do not consider Hezbollah a terrorist group. Hezbollah is what, if you don't want to Palestinians to have any right, of course you can call anybody that supports the Palestinian right a terrorist. Hamas, in my opinion, is not terrorism. Okay. Hamas, you know...
But you're aware that Western governments, Arab governments, and Arab governments consider these groups to be terrorist groups?
I understand, but simply might does not make right. I mean, if the American media is the loudest or the others have most money, that doesn't make them that they are right, morally or otherwise right. The fact is Iran is paying the price of supporting the Palestinian rights. If I were to advise the Iranian government, I would say let the Arabs resolve their own thing. Iran can never do right by Arabs. The thing that Saudis don't know, the minute Iran is cut down to Saad, Israelis are going to turn. They are not going to allow Saudi Arabia
I'm going to come back to that point.
Emerge as the hegemon of Middle East.
Fine, it's an interesting point about Israel side. I'm going to bring in Fahad in a moment to respond. But Rami, I just want to ask you this. When you hear the kind of, when you hear sitting in Lebanon, perhaps, when you hear the Iranians say the Saudis are interfering and sponsoring terrorist groups abroad, and the Saudis are saying the Iranians are sponsoring terrorist groups and meddling in the countries, from the perspective of Lebanon, which, as you said earlier, has been interfered with by many other powers in the region, how do people on the, say, you know, ordinary Lebanese people and other people on the quote-unquote Arab street view these two regional powers both accusing each other of meddling in sovereign nations?
Well, they kind of look at it as political entertainment. They read it in the papers, they watch it on TV, they know the reality. They know that they're both lying through their teeth. They all intervene in other countries. The Saudis for decades and decades have been promoting hardline Wahhabi Islamist doctrines all over the world. The Iranians have been all over the place doing whatever they can. This is what countries do. The Iranians just do it better than the Saudis. That's the problem the Saudis have. They're incompetent at statecraft and they're amateurs at diplomacy.
Fahad, right now, this week in the news, we saw the head of the Israeli military being interviewed by the Saudi press, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia being invited by the Israeli government to Israel. Israel and Saudi Arabia co-sponsoring a resolution against Syria at the UN Human Rights Council. There does seem to be this new close alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel, possibly driven by their shared hatred for Iran.
That is certainly not my reading. I'm not aware of any official communication of any sort between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Saudi Arabia's position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has not changed. It is still, it is very much supportive of the Palestinian leadership. President Mahmoud Abbas was just in Saudi Arabia a few days ago. It remains committed to a two-state solution. And it has said correctly that until that conflict is resolved, that the region will not enjoy any semblance of
stability. So you're saying there's not a new rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel? You're denying what we're all seeing in the news every day?
That is my reading. Just because Saudi Arabia and Israel are concerned about Iran's very destructive role in the region, that does not necessarily mean that this is an alliance. It's a shared concern that is
shared. It's a shared concern, not an alliance, Rami.
An alternative reading that I would offer from the region and watching these two countries and having been to both of them and followed them closely is that political Wahhabism and political Zionism, not religious Wahhabism and religious Judaism, but political Zionism and political Wahhabism have been the two most radicalizing, destructive and disruptive forces in our region for the last 70, 80 years, along with foreign militarism and Arab autocracy. You put those four things together, and this is what we get. The most violent, unstable region in the world, which is getting worse and worse and worse.
Shireen, last word.
Yeah. Well, I think that what Prince bin Salman, which it seems to me, frankly, he has one biggest problem. He was too much spoiled by his father. He thinks that the world is like his palace in Riyadh, and daddy is going to do this, and daddy is going to give him. He is going to realize that outside world is something completely different in ways that he cannot even imagine at the moment.
We'll have to leave it there. We're out of time. Fahad, Shireen, Rami, thank you so much for joining me on the show. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.